A passenger saved a dying flight. No warning. No introduction. She just stood up, walked to the cockpit, and talked a terrified pilot through the worst moment of her career. Nobody knew who she was. Then the F-18 pilots landed, walked across the tarmac, and saluted her. That is when everyone found out. She was a retired United States Navy Top Gun pilot. She took a cab. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was a Thursday. March 7, 2019. The kind of morning that feels like every other morning. Cold. Dark. The sky over Boston still holding on to the night, not quite ready to let it go. Boston Logan International Airport was already loud at 5:15 a.m. Not loud with energy. Loud with exhaustion. Travelers dragging bags. Eyes half shut. Coffee cups in every hand. The particular misery of people who set alarms before 4 in the morning and now deeply regretted their life choices. United Airlines Flight 2291. Boston Logan to Los Angeles International. Airbus A321. Full load. 236 passengers. 8 crew members. Scheduled departure, 6:42 a.m. Gate B22. The gate agent had been calling boarding zones since 6:05. Zone 1. Zone 2. Business select. Families with small children. The usual procession. By 6:30, most people were already seated. Half of them were already asleep. Business travelers with neck pillows and noise-canceling headphones. Students curled against windows. Families with children who had been awake since 3 in the morning and were now limp with exhaustion in their seats. A cross-section of people who had somewhere to be. None of them were thinking about emergencies. Why would they? Row 14. Seat 8, window seat. She was already seated when most people were still in line. A woman. Alone. Late 30s. Short dark hair, no makeup, wire-framed reading glasses pushed up on her nose. Wearing a simple black turtleneck, dark jeans, worn leather boots that had seen better years. One small carry-on bag in the overhead bin. One book in her lap. Not a novel. Not a magazine. A technical aviation manual, thick, dense, the kind with diagrams and performance tables. The margins were full of her own handwriting. Small, precise notations in blue ink. She was reading it the way most people don't read anything anymore. Completely still. No phone. No earbuds. Just reading. Seat 14B was empty. Seat 14C was occupied by an elderly man named Gerald Whitmore. 71 years old. Retired accountant from Hartford, Connecticut. Traveling to Los Angeles to spend 2 weeks with his daughter and 3 grandchildren. Gerald was the kind of man who talked to everyone. Always had been. His wife called it a gift. His children called it exhausting. He tried to start a conversation during boarding. He said something about the weather. Something about Los Angeles. Something about his grandchildren. The woman looked up from her book. Smiled politely. Answered his questions in 3 or 4 words each time. Then went back to reading. Gerald was not offended. He'd been married 43 years. He knew when someone wanted quiet. He put on his own headphones and left her alone. She preferred it that way. The flight manifest listed her as Diane Holloway. Aerospace consultant. Boston, Massachusetts. Accurate. Technically. What the manifest did not say. For 12 years she was Lieutenant Commander Diane Holloway, United States Navy. F divided by a -18 F Super Hornet pilot. Strike Fighter Attack Squadron 103, the Jolly Rogers, based on USS George H.W. Bush. Top Gun graduate. Class of 2007. Graduated first in her class. Her lead instructor wrote in her final evaluation, "Holloway sees the complete tactical picture before most pilots know there is one. Situational awareness at a level I have not encountered in 20 years of instruction. 2,943 total flight hours. 441 carrier landings, the kind where you're hitting a moving runway barely the size of a tennis court in the dark, with no second chances. For combat deployments. She earned the call sign Spectre because she had a particular talent for disappearing. Not literally, though sometimes it seemed like it. Enemy radar couldn't track her cleanly. Her energy management and positioning in the air were so precise that she existed in spaces where other pilots didn't know to look. She won exercises against opponents who never saw her coming. Even her own formation sometimes turned around and were surprised she was still there. Spectre. Because she moved like a ghost. She left the Navy in 2015. Her reason was personal. She never discussed it publicly, and people who knew her well enough to ask knew better than to. What people who served with her did know was this: she left at the height of her career. Not at the end of it. Not after a decline. She was 36 years old, at the peak of her physical and cognitive abilities, with a record that put her in a category of maybe a dozen active pilots in the entire U.S. military. She walked away from all of it. No ceremony. No farewell tour. She cleared her locker, turned in her gear, shook the hands of the people she needed to shake hands with, and drove away from the base on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Her commanding officer at the time, a man who had flown with her for 2 deployments and understood exactly what he was losing, wrote in his final report, "The Navy does not produce pilots like Holloway by design. It produces them by accident, once a generation, and then it does its best to keep them. We did not keep this one. That is our loss, and I suspect it will be someone else's gain, in ways we cannot predict." He was right about that last part. He just didn't know it would happen on a Thursday morning over Pennsylvania. After she left, she built a quiet second life. She worked for an aerospace safety consulting firm in Boston. Analyzing accident data. Writing technical reports. Occasionally advising on aircraft safety reviews. The kind of work that matters enormously and gets almost no attention. She flew commercial a lot. Analyzed those flights in her head the way other people listen to music. Habit. She kept to herself. Lived alone. Kept her professional life and her past in separate compartments. Invisible. Fine with her. Flight 2291 pushed back from Gate B-22 at 6:39 a.m. 3 minutes ahead of schedule. Captain Robert Tran was at the controls for taxi. 51 years old. 18,000 hours of flight time. 22 years with United Airlines. He had flown this route dozens of times. First Officer Sarah Okafor handled the radio calls. 33 years old. 6,200 hours. 3 years with United after 6 years flying regional jets in the Midwest. A solid crew. Experienced. Professional. Takeoff was smooth. The Airbus climbed through overcast skies and broke into clear blue at 12,000 feet. Boston fell away below. The Atlantic glittered briefly before they turned west. Passengers settled in. Flight attendants began beverage service. Diane went back to her book. Gerald dozed off. At 36,000 feet over central Pennsylvania, everything was quiet. For exactly 71 minutes, the flight was completely ordinary. 1 hour and 11 minutes after takeoff. 7:53 a.m. Diane was in the middle of annotating a paragraph about fatigue cycle testing in fuselage panels. She heard a sound. Not an explosion. Not a bang. A crack. Sharp and high-pitched. From somewhere forward and above. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in an aircraft cabin at cruise altitude. Her head came up from the book instantly. Muscle memory from years of cockpit training. Unusual sound equals immediate attention. She looked forward. Looked at the overhead panel. Looked at the flight attendant visible through the curtain near the forward galley. 3 seconds passed. Then everything changed at once. A structural panel in the forward fuselage, weakened by metal fatigue that had developed invisibly between inspection cycles, undetectable without specific non-destructive testing, gave way under the pressure differential between cabin air and the near vacuum outside at 36,000 feet. Explosive decompression. The cabin pressure dropped from normal to nearly zero in 4 seconds. The sound was like the world tearing apart at the seams. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead panels throughout the cabin. The air in the cabin turned to fog for a fraction of a second, moisture condensing instantly as pressure dropped. Loose items flew. Phones, cups, papers, a child's stuffed rabbit, everything not secured shot toward the area of the breach. Passengers screamed. The temperature in the cabin dropped 10 degrees in seconds. Gerald grabbed his armrest with both hands. His face went white. He had no idea what was happening. He knew only that something was catastrophically wrong. Diane already had her mask on. 2 seconds. Flat. She reached up, grabbed, pulled, sealed. The motion was so ingrained it required no conscious thought, hundreds of altitude chamber drills in flight school and through her career. The body remembers what the brain might take too long to process. She helped Gerald with his mask next. Fast, firm, efficient. He was shaking. "Pull it down and breathe normally," she said. "You're fine. Stay seated." She looked forward toward the galley. Flight attendant Carmen Rodriguez, 34 years old, 11 years flying for United, one of the most experienced crew members on this route, was braced against the galley wall. Mask on. Eyes wide. But controlled. She was doing her job. Carmen was scared. Diane could see it. But she was holding. Diane looked at her watch. Her mind was already calculating. 36,000 feet. Time of useful consciousness without supplemental oxygen, approximately 15 seconds for a person at rest, less if they're physically active or caught mid-breath. The pilots had oxygen masks at their stations. But they had to reach those masks, get them on, confirm a proper seal. That took time. Especially if the decompression caught them mid-task, mid-sip of coffee, mid-sentence. 15 seconds. Maybe less. Hypoxia was silent. You didn't feel it coming. Your hands got clumsy first. Then your thinking slowed. Then you thought you were fine, which was the most dangerous part. She stood up. In the years since leaving the Navy, she had thought occasionally about what she would do if something went wrong on one of the many commercial flights she took for work. She had thought about it the way any experienced aviator thinks about it, not with anxiety, but with the quiet professional habit of scenario planning. She had never decided in advance what she would do. She didn't need to. When the moment arrived, she already knew. The body remembered things the mind sometimes forgot. 12 years of responding to emergencies had not left her when she cleared her locker at the base in 2015. They had simply been waiting. Stored somewhere below the level of daily thought. Ready. She stood up. And she went to work. Captain Robert Tran had been reaching for his coffee mug when the decompression hit. He was mid-reach. Left hand extended. Mind not on anything in particular, in the comfortable autopilot state of cruise flight where everything is monitoring and nothing requires active input. The shock of the decompression, the sound, the pressure change, the sudden fog in the cabin air, cost him 3 seconds. 3 seconds of confusion before training took over and he reached for his oxygen mask. In a normal situation, 3 seconds wouldn't matter. At 36,000 feet in explosive decompression, 3 seconds was the difference between full cognitive function and impairment. He got his mask on. But hypoxia had already touched the edges of his thinking. Subtle. Insidious. The exact way hypoxia always worked, a slight fuzziness at the periphery of consciousness that felt, to the person experiencing it, like nothing at all. Like being fine. First Officer Sarah Okafor had reacted faster. She'd been actively cross-checking instruments when the decompression hit. Her hands were already on the panel. Her mask was on in under 2 seconds. Seal confirmed. She was already initiating the emergency descent checklist. But something was wrong with her captain. Tran was conscious. Talking. Following along in broad strokes. But his instrument scan was off. He kept returning to the same gauge. His hands moved slowly when she asked him to confirm items on the checklist. His responses had a half-second delay that shouldn't have been there. Okafor had 6,200 hours. She had never handled an explosive decompression outside a simulator. Nobody had ever knocked on her cockpit door during an emergency before. She was managing a critical emergency with a compromised captain, alone, at 36,000 feet, with 236 people in the cabin behind her. She keyed the passenger address system. Ladies and gentlemen, we have experienced a loss of cabin pressure. An emergency descent is in progress. Please ensure your oxygen masks are on and tightened. Remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Her voice was controlled. Measured. Professional. Her hands were shaking. She reached for the radio. Philadelphia Center, United 2291, declaring emergency, explosive decompression at flight level 360, initiating emergency descent, diverting to Philadelphia International, souls on board 244. Controller came back immediately, United 2291, Roger emergency, you are cleared to descend unrestricted, direct Philadelphia, emergency equipment will be standing by, say Captain status. She hesitated for 1 second. Captain is, functional, she said. I am flying the aircraft. Then someone knocked on the cockpit door. Getting to the cockpit door was not simple. The cabin was in controlled chaos. Passengers gripping armrests. A child crying somewhere near the back. The wind noise from the structural breach was loud and continuous. Everything loose had already settled, but the psychological chaos was ongoing. Carmen intercepted Diane at the forward galley. Ma'am. You need to return to your seat. Mask on. Please. I'm a former Navy aviator. F-18 pilot. Top Gun graduate. Diane's voice was completely flat. No urgency in it, which was itself a kind of urgency. Your captain is likely experiencing mild hypoxia. Your first officer needs assistance managing the emergency descent and coordinating the diversion. I need cockpit access right now. Carmen had been flying for 11 years. She had dealt with hundreds of passenger situations. Medical emergencies. Aggressive passengers. Equipment failures. Turbulence severe enough to send the trolley into the ceiling. She had never heard a passenger speak like this. Not the words. The words could be faked. The delivery. That couldn't be faked. There was no performance in it. No desperation. No showing off. Just a person stating facts and telling her what was needed. Carmen made a decision in under 3 seconds. She stepped aside. Diane moved to the cockpit door. Knocked twice. Okafor's voice through the interphone, identify yourself. Passenger. Former U.S. Navy aviator. Lieutenant Commander, retired. I believe your captain has mild hypoxia from delayed mask donning. I can assist with secondary communications and monitor his condition while you fly the aircraft. Please open the door. 4 seconds of silence. The longest 4 seconds of the morning. The door clicked open. Diane took in the cockpit in one pass. The way a pilot looks at a cockpit, not the way a passenger would, not reading individual instruments one at a time, but seeing the whole picture simultaneously. The Gestalt. The status of everything at once. Tran was in his seat. Oxygen mask on. Conscious. His hands were on the controls but not actively flying. Okafor had the aircraft. His eyes were moving but slowly, returning to the altimeter repeatedly in a way that suggested his scan wasn't working properly. Okafor was doing everything right. Descent initiated. Autopilot disconnected. Aircraft in a controlled steep descent through 28,000 feet, targeting 10,000 where the ambient oxygen would be sufficient. ATC contact established. Diversion declared. She was doing it alone. And she was scared. Not panicked. Scared. There was a difference. Panic was incapacitating. Fear was manageable if you had something to hold on to. Diane slid into the observer jump seat behind the center console. First Officer Okafor. I'm Diane Holloway. I'm here to support you, not replace you. You are doing everything correctly. What do you need from me? Okafor's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror and back to her instruments. Who are you? Someone who has done emergency descents in worse conditions. Talk to me. What's your biggest concern right now? A beat. Then, Captain is slow. His responses aren't normal. I don't know how much I can rely on his inputs. I can see that. Here's what we do. You fly. I'll monitor him and handle secondary radio communications. If his inputs become dangerous I will tell you immediately and clearly. You make the final calls. Agreed? Agreed. Diane reached for the secondary radio panel. Philadelphia approach, United 2291. I am a former U.S. Navy aviator, call sign Spectre, Lieutenant Commander Holloway, VFA 103, now a civilian passenger. I am in the cockpit assisting First Officer Okafor. Captain Tran is conscious but showing signs of mild hypoxia following decompression. Requesting priority approach, full emergency services on ground, and requesting Navy F-18 escort from NAS Willow Grove for visual approach support. I can authenticate. A pause from approach control. Then, United 2291, authenticate. Diane gave her service number. Her dates of commissioning and separation. VFA 103. Her Top Gun class year. 30 seconds. A different voice came on. Senior Controller. United 2291, authentication in progress. Ma'am, you said call sign Spectre. Confirmed. Past tense. Stand by. Tran looked over at the jump seat. He was confused. That much was clear. A woman he didn't recognize was sitting in his cockpit talking on his radio. Who? Captain Tran, I'm Diane Holloway, aerospace consultant, former Navy. You lost approximately 4 minutes following the decompression. You're recovering. First Officer Okafor has the aircraft and is doing everything correctly. Focus on your oxygen and let her bring you down to safe altitude. Your head will clear. Tran looked at Okafor. Okafor nodded without looking back. She's right, sir. Let me fly. Just back me up on speed calls when we get lower. Tran settled back. He trusted her. That was the right call. 8 minutes after Diane's radio call. Flight 2291 was passing through 22,000 feet, still in steep descent. The cabin pressure was beginning to equalize. Passengers were calmer. Not calm, nothing about this was calm, but the acute terror of the first 2 minutes had transitioned into a frightened, desperate waiting. Gerald Whitmore was praying quietly, rosary beads in both hands. He hadn't prayed with a rosary in 40 years, but the beads had been in his jacket pocket since his wife packed them there 3 years ago and he'd never taken them out. Outside the left windows, 2 shapes appeared. Gray. Fast. Closing from the northwest in a tight formation. F divided by a -18 F Super Hornets. Naval Air Station Willow Grove Reserve Unit. Scrambled on priority request within 6 minutes of Diane's authentication clearing the system. They slid into position off the left wing with the precise, controlled ease of pilots who had done this 10,000 times in practice and a handful of times for real. Lead pilot keyed the emergency frequency. United 2291, Ghost 1, flight of 2 Hornets, we are visual on you. Who is managing your aircraft? Diane keyed back, Ghost 1, this is former Lieutenant Commander Holloway, VFA 103, Jolly Rogers. I am assisting First Officer Okafor who is flying the aircraft. Captain has mild hypoxia, recovering. We are on emergency descent to Philadelphia. Requesting visual approach monitoring and wing escort to runway. A longer pause than expected. Holloway. Diane Holloway. Not a question. Confirmed, Diane said. Ma'am, this is Commander Rafael Reyes. I was a junior officer in VFA 103 in 2012. You were department head. I don't know if you'd remember. I remember, Reyes. You flew well. A brief pause. Then, differently, ma'am. We're yours. What do you need? Close formation on my left wing. Give First Officer Okafor a visual reference point for alignment. We'll be hand-flying the final approach, autopilot off. Call out any drift from centerline you see and give me altitude checks below 1,000 feet. Keep your calls short. Copy, Spectre. Tightening up. The 2 Hornets slid closer. Close enough that passengers on the left side could see the pilots' helmets. Could see the details of the aircraft. Could see the Jolly Roger skull and crossbones on the tail fins. Okafor had heard the entire exchange. She glanced back at Diane. Looked at this woman in a black turtleneck and reading glasses who had just been addressed by military fighter pilots with the kind of tone you used for someone far more senior than yourself. They know you. They knew who I was, Diane said. Keep your eyes on the instruments. What's your sync rate? Okafor looked back at her panel. 1,800 feet per minute. Altitude 19,000. Good. Start thinking about your approach briefing. We'll need configuration by 8,000. By 18,000 feet, the change in tran was visible. The cabin had pressurized partially through the descent to lower altitude where the thicker air helped, and his supplemental oxygen had been flowing continuously. Hypoxia was reversing. The fog at the edges of his thinking was clearing. His instrument scan normalized. His eyes moved properly, altimeter to airspeed to vertical speed, the pattern every pilot drills until it's involuntary. He looked around the cockpit. Saw Diane in the observer seat. Saw the 2 F-18s off the left wing. Saw his first officer handling the aircraft with the quiet competence of someone who had stepped into a situation far bigger than anything she practiced and was meeting it. How long? He asked. 8 minutes, Diane said. Give or take. Your FO handled it from the start. She made every correct call. I've been monitoring communications. It wasn't the complete truth. But the complete truth could wait until they were on the ground. Right now Tran needed to be functional for landing. He needed his confidence. He needed to feel like a captain, not like a passenger in his own cockpit. Do you need to take over? He asked Okafor. No, sir, Okafor said. I have it. Would you run the approach checklist with me? I'll call the items, you confirm. It was the right thing to say. It gave him something real to do. Something that required his expertise and his attention without putting him in a position where imperfect execution could cost anyone anything. Tran straightened in his seat. Ready when you are. Diane watched this exchange quietly. Said nothing. Philadelphia International Airport. Runway 27 left. The longest available, given wind conditions. Approach control had already cleared a wide corridor. No other aircraft within 15 miles of the approach path. Controllers at Philadelphia had been working quietly and efficiently since the first emergency call, holding other traffic in patterns, rerouting departures, making space. That was their version of what Diane was doing in the cockpit. Quiet competence in the background. Work that nobody would write about. The approach controller handling Flight 2291 had been at his position for 6 hours already. His name was David Kowalski. 44 years old. 19 years with the FAA. He had handled emergencies before, engine failures, medical diversions, a wheels-up situation 8 years ago that still visited him occasionally in dreams. He had never handled an explosive decompression with a hypoxic captain and a former Navy Top Gun pilot in the observer seat. He kept his voice as flat and steady as hers. He owed her that much. Traffic on his frequency heard the exchange between Kowalski and the cockpit of Flight 2291. Several pilots monitoring the emergency frequency later described the quality of communication as unlike anything they had heard in normal operations. Short transmissions. No wasted words. No emotion in any of it. Just information moving in both directions at exactly the speed it needed to move. One regional jet captain who'd been holding at 8,000 feet waiting for his approach clearance keyed his mic after Flight 2291 touched down. He said nothing. Just held down the transmit button for 2 seconds. Everyone on frequency understood. Emergency vehicles had been staging since the first radio call. Fire trucks, ambulances, airport emergency response vehicles, lined along both sides of the runway in 2 parallel rows extending nearly the full length. The airport had declared full ground emergency. Other traffic was being held. The airspace around Philadelphia approach had been cleared for priority handling of Flight 2291. At 10,000 feet, Diane gave the aircraft back to her crew completely. Not that she'd ever truly taken it from them. But she stepped back in every way that mattered, stayed quiet, kept her communications minimal, let Okafor and Tran build their working rhythm back. Ghost 1 and Ghost 2 maintained their left-wing position. Through 8,000 feet, Okafor called for flap configuration. Through 5,000, the gear came down. Through 3,000, the 2 aircraft were established on the ILS, the instrument landing system that provided precision guidance to the runway, with the Hornets holding their relative position. Reyes was calling centerline confirmation every 30 seconds. Short transmissions. Just what was needed. Nothing more. Diane monitored the airspeed. Monitored the sink rate. Watched the approach with the part of her that never stopped being a pilot even when the rest of her was trying to be something else. 1,000 feet. Speed 148 knots. Sink rate 700. You're on glide path. Her voice was conversational. Not tense. Like discussing something interesting she'd noticed. First time in the approach she'd said anything in 10 minutes. Okafor heard it. Felt something settle. 500 feet. Slight drift right. Correct gently. Okafor made a small input. The aircraft eased back toward centerline. Ghost 1 confirmed, centerline good. Looking solid. 300 feet. 200 feet. Ghost 1 confirms you're aligned. 100 feet. Flare coming. Smooth on the back pressure. 50 feet. The runway came up to meet them. The main gear touched. A chirp of rubber on asphalt. Perfectly on centerline. Perfectly on the numbers. The nose wheel came down. Thrust reversers deployed. The aircraft decelerated and turned off at the midfield taxiway. All 236 passengers alive. All 8 crew members alive. No injuries beyond minor bruising from the initial decompression jolt. Okafor sat in her seat for a moment after they cleared the runway. She realized her hands were shaking. She realized they had been shaking since the beginning and she hadn't noticed. The emergency vehicles converged immediately. Paramedics boarded within 3 minutes of the aircraft stopping. Every passenger was assessed. 4 were treated for minor injuries, bruising, a sprained wrist from gripping an armrest during sudden turbulence following the decompression, 1 passenger with a panic attack who needed oxygen and reassurance. Gerald Whitmore sat in his seat for a full 10 minutes after the aircraft stopped. Both hands still wrapped around his rosary. Eyes closed. When he finally stood up and gathered his things, he turned to seat 14A. Empty. She had already gone. Diane had moved forward with the first group off the aircraft. Bag over one shoulder. Glasses back on. Book tucked under her arm. She looked like someone trying to catch a connecting flight. Carmen stopped her at the door. "Ma'am. Please wait." Diane stopped. Turned. Looked at Carmen. Carmen didn't know what she wanted to say. She'd been flying 11 years. She'd seen difficult situations. She'd never seen anything like what had just happened. "Thank you," Carmen finally said. "Whatever you did. Thank you. Your first officer saved this flight," Diane said. "Tell her that." She waited at the jetway at Carmen's request. Outside, Ghost 1 and Ghost 2 had landed on the crossing runway. Commander Rafael Reyes and his wingman, Lieutenant Commander James Park, were walking across the tarmac in full flight gear. Helmets under their arms. The afternoon sun catching the Jolly Rogers insignia on their flight suits. They crossed toward the jetway entrance. Reyes spotted her immediately. A woman in a black turtleneck. Reading glasses. A small carry-on bag. Looking, for all the world, like someone waiting for a taxi. He stopped in front of her. He looked at this woman for a moment. This woman who had identified a hypoxic captain from a passenger seat. Who had talked a scared first officer through her first real emergency with the calm precision of a flight instructor. Who had authenticated military assets and coordinated their use in real time. Who had called altitudes and speeds on final approach until the wheels were on the ground. Who had done all of it without ever raising her voice, without ever taking control from the people whose job it was to have control, without ever making it about herself for even a single second. Reyes came to attention. Full military brace. Heels together. Saluted. Park did the same. "Spectre," Reyes said. "The Navy lost something real when you left." Diane looked at both of them. A moment passed. "The Navy gained Sarah Okafor," she said. "She did the hard part. I just talked." She picked up her bag. Started walking. Then stopped. Turned back once. "Good formation work today, Reyes. Tell Park the same." She walked away. They watched her go. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Park said, "Did she just compliment us?" "Yes," Reyes said. "What do we do?" "Nothing," Reyes said. "That's all we get. That's the whole thing." The story broke on March 28. A Philadelphia Inquirer aviation journalist had been piecing it together since the day after the incident. The NTSB preliminary report mentioned passenger assistance. FAA records showed the authentication request. The call sign Spectre appeared in a Philadelphia approach control transcript that became publicly available through a records request. A retired Navy officer who'd gone through Top Gun a few years after Diane's class recognized the name and the call sign and made a phone call to the journalist. Within 72 hours of publication, the story was everywhere. Television. Online. International wire services. Quiet woman saved 236 lives, then F-18 pilots revealed her Top Gun past. Every version of the story had the same basic structure. The flight, the decompression, the passenger who turned out to be former military, the F-18 escort, the landing. The call sign Spectre. The way the military pilots had saluted her on the tarmac. Diane gave no interviews. She issued one statement through her firm's public affairs contact. It read: First Officer Sarah Okafor saved United Flight 2291. She identified and managed a critical emergency correctly from its first moments, maintained aircraft control throughout the event, coordinated with air traffic control, and executed a precise instrument approach under significant pressure with no warning and no preparation time. I was a passenger who provided some assistance when invited to do so by the crew. That is the complete and accurate account of what happened. Please direct your attention to First Officer Okafor. No further comment. Sarah Okafor gave one interview. NBC News. 3 days after the story broke. The interviewer asked her about the woman who came into the cockpit. Okafor was quiet for a moment before answering. She sat down next to me and the first thing she said was, "You're doing everything correctly." Okafor shook her head slightly. That was the moment things changed for me. Not because she took over. She didn't take over. Because she saw what I was doing and she told me it was right. Do you know how rare that is? In an emergency, when everything is loud and terrifying and you have no way of knowing if the decisions you're making are good ones, to have someone sit next to you who genuinely knows what they're looking at, and tell you that you're right. That's everything. I didn't know who she was until we were on the ground. Didn't matter. What mattered was her voice. Completely calm. Like she'd done this before. Which, Okafor paused, she had. The interviewer asked if she thought of Diane as her hero. Okafor considered this. I think she would hate that word, she said finally. I think she'd want me to say that I flew the aircraft. Which I did. She'd want me to say that I made the calls. Which I did. She'd want the credit to go to the crew. Which it should. But here's the thing. Okafor looked directly at the camera. She was there. And the way she was there, calm, certain, not trying to be anything except useful, that's its own kind of skill. That's not nothing. That's something I've been thinking about every day since. Commander Rafael Reyes gave a brief statement to Navy Times. He was careful with his words. We were scrambled on a priority authentication request. We were told a passenger on the aircraft had authenticated as former U.S. Navy and was requesting fighter escort. We launched expecting, I don't know what we expected. Maybe a former commercial pilot with some military background. Maybe a retired officer who'd flown transports. When we made radio contact, we heard a call sign we recognized. In our community, that name meant something specific. It still does. Spectre wasn't just a pilot. Spectre was a particular kind of pilot. The kind who's already 3 moves ahead of every situation, who makes the difficult look like the obvious, who has a way of making everyone around them better just by being present. She was sitting in seat 14A reading a book. She spent the next 40 minutes keeping 236 people alive in the quietest way I've ever seen anyone do anything. Then she walked away and told us all to write about the first officer. A pause in the transcript. That's Spectre, Reyes said. Exactly. That's the whole person in that one moment. Gerald Whitmore spoke to a local Hartford news crew 10 days after the landing. He was sitting in his daughter's backyard in Los Angeles. 3 grandchildren running around on the grass behind him. His rosary beads on the table beside his chair. He said he hadn't really understood what had happened until his daughter read him the news story. He said he hadn't known the woman in 14A was anyone special. She seemed like a quiet person, he said. Someone who wanted to be left alone. I respected that. I left her alone. He smiled at the camera. I'm glad she didn't leave me alone. He was referring to the oxygen mask. The way she'd reached across the empty seat between them in the first seconds of the decompression, confirmed his mask was sealed correctly, and said in a completely calm voice, "You're fine. Stay seated." I've been on a lot of airplanes, Gerald said. 40 years of business travel. I know what scared sounds like. She didn't sound scared. He picked up the rosary beads and looked at them. She sounded like someone who knew exactly what was going to happen next. The National Transportation Safety Board's preliminary findings, released 6 weeks after the incident, confirmed the cause. Metal fatigue in a forward fuselage structural panel. The fatigue had developed between inspection intervals and was not detectable without specific non-destructive testing methodology that was not then part of the standard inspection protocol for that airframe age and cycle count. The NTSB also noted, in a single paragraph near the end of the preliminary report, the presence of a qualified aviation professional among the passenger manifest provided material assistance to the flight crew during a period when the captain was experiencing hypoxic cognitive impairment. The passengers' actions were consistent with established crew resource management principles and were credited with contributing to a successful outcome. 1 paragraph. That was the official acknowledgement. Diane's firm issued a brief response to media inquiries asking about the NTSB language. Ms. Holloway has no comment on the NTSB findings. She remains of the view that First Officer Okafor's performance was the determining factor in the outcome of the flight. September 2019. Sarah Okafor was promoted to captain. The youngest woman to hold captain rank in her United Airlines base. She got the call on a Tuesday morning. She was in a hotel room in Denver, between flights, drinking bad coffee and reading through weather reports for the next day's operation. Her chief pilot called to give her the news. She thanked him. Hung up. Sat for a moment. Then she sent a single text message to a number she'd been given by United's chief of operations, who had tracked it down at Okafor's request after the flight. The message said, "Made captain today. Wanted you to know. Sarah Okafor." The reply came 4 hours later. It said, "I know. Congratulations, Captain. You earned it. D.H." Okafor read it twice. Then she smiled. She went back to her weather reports. Outside the hotel window, Denver was doing what Denver does in September. Mountains to the west, going purple in the late afternoon light. A sky that looked like someone had polished it. She had a flight tomorrow morning. 6:30 departure. She had work to do. She went back to work. The Monday after the Philadelphia landing, she was in her office in Boston at 7:30 a.m. Her desk looked the same as it always did. Technical report stacked on the left. A half-finished cup of coffee from Friday still sitting in the exact spot she had left it. A photograph on the shelf behind her monitor, her and 2 other pilots on the flight deck of USS George H.W. Bush, squinting into the sun somewhere over the Persian Gulf, all 3 of them grinning with the particular satisfaction of people who have just done something very difficult and come out the other side. She sat down. Opened her laptop. Picked up where she had left off. Her colleagues knew, of course. It had been on the news for 2 days before she came back in. Everyone in the office had seen it. The Philadelphia Inquirer piece. The follow-up stories. The clip from NBC with Sarah Okafor talking about the voice in the cockpit. Nobody said anything to her directly. They had worked with her long enough to understand that this was the correct response. Her supervisor, a former Air Force test pilot named Davies who had known her for 4 years, sent her a single email. It said, "Good work. See you Monday." She replied, "See you Monday." That was the entire conversation. It was, she felt, exactly right. The week the story broke, she forwarded all media inquiries to her firm's communications department without reading them. She completed 3 safety analysis reports that month. One on fatigue cycle inspection protocols for narrow-body aircraft, informed, her colleagues later noted, by a set of insights that seemed unusually specific and practically grounded. The report recommended changes to non-destructive testing requirements at certain airframe ages and cycle counts. 2 of those recommendations were adopted into FAA guidance 14 months later. She never mentioned the connection publicly. She continued to fly commercial for work. Window seat when available. Book in her lap. Completely unremarkable. The woman in the window seat reading the technical manual. Invisible. Fine with her. This was always her preference. Not because she was modest in the performance sense. Not because she was hiding. Because she understood something that most people in her position, with her skills, her history, her record, never fully worked out. The work was the thing. Not the recognition of the work. The actual doing of it. She had spent 12 years flying the most demanding aircraft in the U.S. military inventory off the decks of aircraft carriers in every conceivable condition. She had flown in combat. She had made decisions in fractions of seconds that determined outcomes that mattered. And through all of it, the part that she had valued, the only part she had ever truly valued, was the moment when the situation required everything she had and she gave it. Not the medal afterward. Not the entry in the logbook. The moment itself. 7:53 a.m. over Pennsylvania. That was a moment. She had been there for it. That was enough. While Diane sat in the cockpit observer seat, 236 people behind her were living the longest 32 minutes of their lives. Flight attendant Carmen Rodriguez managed the cabin alone. Alone in the way that flight attendants are trained to be alone. The way the job demands. You get your mask on. You assess the situation. You work. She moved through the cabin row by row. There was a mother in row 22 holding 2 children, one under each arm, both screaming. Carmen crouched in the aisle. Checked their masks. Checked the seals. Spoke directly to the mother. Not to the children, to the mother. Because if the mother was calm, the children had a chance of becoming calm. Your masks are on correctly. The pilots are handling this. We are going to land safely. Look at me. Are you hurt? The mother shook her head. Good. Hold your children and breathe. That is your job right now. She moved to the next row. A man in row 18 had taken his mask off. He was hyperventilating. Thought the mask was suffocating him, which was the panic talking, which was the exact wrong thing but completely human. Carmen put it back on. Held it there with both hands for 10 seconds. Talked to him until his breathing slowed. Row 11. An elderly woman traveling alone, completely silent, both hands flat on her tray table, staring forward. Not panicking. Somewhere else entirely. Carmen checked her mask, touched her shoulder, got a single nod in return. Some people went inward during emergencies. Carmen knew that. Let her be. The temperature in the cabin had dropped sharply in the first minutes. It was cold now. Not dangerous cold but the kind of cold that made everything feel more precarious. More real. Passengers had pulled jackets and blankets over themselves. The wind noise from the structural breach had dropped as they descended to lower altitude. At 36,000 feet it had been a roar. By 20,000 it was a loud hiss. By 15,000 it was almost background. But nobody in the cabin forgot it was there. Gerald Whitmore had his rosary beads out. Both hands wrapped around them. Eyes closed. He was not a man who prayed often in his daily life. He had not been inside a church in 3 years, not since his wife's funeral. The beads had been in his jacket pocket since the day she was buried. He never thought about them. They were just there, the way grief is just there, carried without thinking. He thought about his daughter waiting in Los Angeles. His 3 grandchildren. The youngest one, 4 years old, who called him Pop Pop and had a habit of running full speed into his knees whenever he arrived. He thought, I want to get there. Simple as that. He kept his eyes closed and his hands on the beads and let the pilots do their work. 3 rows behind Gerald, a 23-year-old graduate student named Marcus Webb was doing something that surprised even himself. He was completely calm. He didn't understand why. He had expected to panic. He was the kind of person who panicked, at exams, at job interviews, at difficult conversations. He had always known this about himself. But something about the PA announcement, the first officer's voice, controlled and professional, had anchored him. He kept thinking about that voice. How certain it had been. Not fake certain. Actually certain. He decided that if the person flying this aircraft was that calm, he could be calm too. He put on his mask properly. Checked his seatbelt. Put his phone in his pocket. Folded his hands on his tray table. And waited. Later, when reporters asked passengers to describe what the descent felt like, Marcus would say, the pilot's voice did not shake. I decided that was enough to hold on to. He didn't know about Diane then. He didn't know that the first officer's voice hadn't shaken in part because someone had sat down next to her and told her she was doing everything right. The chain of calm went all the way back. Carmen Rodriguez sat in her jump seat on the forward left side of the aircraft for 11 minutes after they cleared the runway. Paramedics had boarded. Passengers were being assessed. Everything was under control. She sat in her jump seat and did not move. 11 years of flying. She had handled medical emergencies, aggressive passengers, severe turbulence, a fire in the forward galley that turned out to be a malfunctioning coffee maker but felt like the end of the world for 45 seconds. She had never handled this. Nobody had. She thought about the moment Diane had appeared at the galley curtain. The moment she had made her decision in under 3 seconds and stepped aside. She had never let a passenger go forward before. Everything in her training said otherwise. But training was a framework. Not a script. The woman in the black turtleneck had not sounded like a passenger. She had sounded like someone who had already solved this problem in her head and was now informing you of the solution. Calm. Flat. No wasted words. Carmen had made a judgment call. She had been right. She sat in her jump seat and replayed every decision she had made from the moment the panel gave way. The mask. The galley brace. The cabin walk. The woman in row 14. Every second of it. Looking for the mistake. She did not find one. That surprised her more than anything. A supervisor from United's emergency response team found her still in the jump seat and asked if she needed medical attention. Carmen shook her head. I need 5 more minutes, she said. He left her alone. She used the 5 minutes. Then she stood up, straightened her uniform, and walked back through the cabin to help the last passengers deplane. That was the job. She did it. Sarah Okafor sat in the left seat for a long time after the aircraft stopped. Captain Tran had stepped off the aircraft to speak with emergency personnel and United's operations team on the ground. His hypoxia had fully cleared. He was lucid and functional. He was also going to have a difficult conversation with the company medical team, which was standard procedure. The cockpit was quiet for the first time in 40 minutes. Okafor looked at her hands on the yoke. They had stopped shaking somewhere around 5,000 feet on the approach. She hadn't noticed when. She had been too busy flying. She looked out the windscreen at the row of emergency vehicles on the taxiway. Fire trucks. Ambulances. Airport rescue. All of it staged for Flight 2291. For her. For the 236 people she had brought down. She thought about the first seconds after the decompression. The way the sound had hit. The way she had gone straight for her mask out of pure trained instinct and gotten it on correctly, which in that moment had been the single most important physical act of her life. 1 second faster than Tran. 1 second that gave her the cognitive clarity she needed to manage the next 40 minutes. She thought about the voice from the observer seat. You are doing everything correctly. She had not known then who was speaking. Didn't matter. What mattered was that in the moment when she was most alone, truly alone, with a compromised captain and 236 lives and no one to tell her if she was doing the right thing, someone had looked at what she was doing and confirmed it. That was the thing about the voice. It was not comfort. It was not reassurance in the soft sense. It was assessment. Accurate, expert assessment, delivered by someone who genuinely knew. That was different. That meant something real. She sat in the left seat and understood something she would spend a long time trying to articulate to other people. The voice had not saved the flight. She had saved the flight. But the voice had saved her ability to believe she was saving it. And that was not nothing. That was everything. She took a long breath. Reached for the post-flight checklist. Started working through it. One item at a time. The way you always do. United Airlines Flight 2291 never completed its original journey. The 236 passengers were rebooked on other flights to Los Angeles throughout that Thursday and the following morning. Most of them arrived in Los Angeles by Thursday evening. Gerald Whitmore arrived at 9:47 p.m. His daughter and 3 grandchildren were waiting at arrivals. He hugged each of his grandchildren for a long time. He didn't explain why. He didn't have words for it yet. He had them now, standing in the airport in Los Angeles with his family around him. He had them because a quiet woman in a black turtleneck had been reading a book in the window seat next to him. He never found out her full story. He didn't need to. He had 3 grandchildren to push on the swings in the morning. That was the whole story, as far as he was concerned. That was everything. Seat 14A on Flight 2291 flew again 6 weeks later, after the aircraft completed its repairs and recertification. A different passenger sat in it. A sales manager from Chicago who slept through the entire flight to Los Angeles, didn't know the story of the seat he was sitting in, and arrived at LAX thinking only about his rental car reservation. The seat didn't know the difference. Seats never do. But somewhere in Boston, a woman in a black turtleneck was sitting at her desk reading a technical report about metal fatigue in narrow-body fuselage structures, making small precise notations in the margins in blue ink. The report would eventually contribute to changes in inspection protocols. Those changes would eventually prevent other failures. The passengers on those future flights would never know why. They wouldn't know about the woman who read aviation manuals on her days off. Who sat in window seats and watched the instruments in her mind. Who had spent 12 years learning to see the whole picture before anyone else knew there was one. They wouldn't know about Spectre. That was exactly how she wanted it. There is a kind of courage that announces itself. It wears medals. It gives speeches. It stands in front of cameras and accepts the acknowledgement it has earned. That courage is real. It matters. But there is another kind. The kind that sits in seat 14A with a technical manual and a cup of bad airport coffee. The kind that has nothing to prove because it already knows what it is. The kind that walks into the hardest moment in a room full of people and does exactly what is needed, no more, no less, and then walks away before anyone can make it into something larger than it was. Diane Holloway did not save 236 lives because she wanted to be remembered. She saved them because she was there. Because she had spent 12 years becoming exactly the kind of person who could. Because when the world tore open at 36,000 feet over Pennsylvania, she already knew what to do. She had always known. That is the whole story. That is all of it.